Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. Tim, Michael, Mo, and the occasional guest discussing digital analytics issues of the day. Find them on Facebook at facebook.com/analytics hour and their website analyticshour.io. And now, the Digital Analytics Power Hour.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Analytics Power Hour. This is episode 129. Imagine you're joining a new company and you're tasked with taking their digital analytics program to the heights that the chief marketing officer desires, namely predictive analytics and something, AI, ML, what have you. What to do? You immediately dig in and realize that your predecessors have left you with something of a mess when it comes to the current behavioral data collection. It is both inaccurate and broken in many places. And there are obvious and important aspects of functionality that simply have no data collection at all. It is almost as if most of us spend 70% of our jobs just patching up holes in our data or attempting to produce insights and recommendations while ingeniously navigating the potholes and dead zones in our events, EVARs, and etc. Tim, as the quintessential analyst, I am sure you have found a total workaround and are not bothered by these issues.
Let's put those issues aside and let's talk about the accuracy of your 70% statistic of how we spend our time. I question the accuracy of that.
It's been proven by data science.
Okay. Well,
and data scientists have spent 85% of their time engineering that data to give that prediction. So there you go.
Okay, then we're covered.
Yeah, we're totally.
Perfect. I do the same thing with actual behavioral data.
There you go. All right. And Mo, does this ring true for you?
Oh, yeah. This sounds like the bane of my existence, other than mechanical keyboards, which are much worse than data accuracy.
Yeah, that sounds like an issue that will be a top concern for the podcast going forward. All right, and I'm Michael Helbig, and finally a show topic I have more than a passing knowledge about, but we wanted a deeper discussion, so we turned to our guest. Yali Sassoon is the co-founder and chief product officer at Snowplow Analytics. Prior to that, he has held strategy, marketing, and analytics roles at companies like PwC, Kepler LLP, and OpenX, and more. Today, he is our guest. Welcome to the show, Yali.
Thank you, Michael.
All right, so let's kick it off, and just maybe to help level set this conversation and sort of like, well, why the heck is this guy on the show? Talk to us a little bit about Snowplow Analytics, what it's for, what it does.
So Snowplow is a digital data collection platform. So companies run our technology to collect similar sort of data that they might collect from Adobe or Google, so web data, mobile data, but also potentially customer data from other channels like support desk or email or online chatbots and those sorts of things. But unlike the Googles and Adobes of the world, we focus exclusively on the data collection piece. So we see our jobs as really delivering the data into the places that analysts and scientists and other people can take in and use in the different ways that they want. So into the data warehouse, into potentially a real-time stream or a unified log. So you can have applications that are consuming the data. But we're just to double down, we're focused very much on the data collection side of things. And so things like data accuracy and data completeness are preoccupations of ours. And I spent a lot of my time thinking about both those things.
Nice.
So you mentioned that data accuracy is a topic that you're a little bit obsessed with, as am I. Well, I pretty much think that any analyst or person working in analytics spends a lot of time thinking about this topic. What does data accuracy mean to you?
Oh, that's a good question.
I like to start big,
Look, data accuracy it's to what extent does the data reflect the reality that it's supposed to describe? So when we're collecting data, we're fundamentally building a record of things that have happened. And typically we want to analyze that data to figure out why what happened, so that we can use that knowledge to change the future. And so for me, data accuracy is about the gap between what the data tells us happened and what really happened. And I guess the fundamental challenge with data accuracy is, in a typical organization, the data is is the source of truth. And so figuring out like what that gap is between what the data says happened and what really happened is just a fundamentally a really hard problem to solve, because like it's how do you measure how accurate a ruler is? That's the fundamental challenge.
But I feel like there's a lot of confusion. Accuracy seems like one of those things that's such a simple idea. And as you just defined it, as accuracy is how well is the data actually reflecting reality. So like we've recently talked a lot about ITP and we know ad blockers. And so there's a lot of things where we say we can point to where in absolute terms, the data is not perfectly reflecting reality. It seems like there's another layer of how accurate does it need to be that generally I think the curve of the cost of getting more accurate data, getting from 90 to 95% accurate is a lot cheaper than getting from 95% to 96% accurate. And there's the source of truth. Are we accurately reflecting reality? But then there's also so many questions. Is the data good enough for us to make the right decision enough of the time at low enough cost that it's worthwhile? And that starts to become a pretty squishy kind of topic, right?
I think that's a really nice way to look at it. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a sense in which accuracy is kind of, you want to talk about it in absolute terms. You want to be like, this is reality and this is what the data says, and this is where the data doesn't say anything, or this is the bit the data misses, and this is the bit where the data says something happened but really something else happened, and there's that gap. And you're absolutely right. For a lot of what we do, we should be really comfortable with that gap. Like the whole discipline of statistics was born to let scientists make validated statements about big groups of things, about populations, based on measurements of just a sample of those populations. And in digital analytics, it's that there are a whole bunch of analyses where we don't need anywhere close to levels of 100% accuracy. So if you're interested in overall traffic patterns and big groups of things and the behaviors of big groups of people, you really don't need a very, very accurate data set at all. Or you can have a very, very accurate data set about a sample set of those users and then make pretty reliable inferences across the whole group. I think the challenge is that in the last few years in digital, people are doing more and more with the data. So we've moved well beyond a world where digital analysts were just talking about overall traffic patterns and which marketing channel is driving up visits to the website and how's our conversion rate doing. And we're starting to segment users into smaller and smaller groups. And as we're doing that, the need for accuracy starts to climb. And in the limit, if you're doing stuff with personalization and you're really trying to do things like serve a particular user something relevant based on what you know about them, if half of what you should know about them is missing, you're not going to serve that person a relevant recommendation. So you're totally right. We've got to tie the question of accuracy to what we're doing with the data, and we've got to tie the cost to the benefit of answering those questions accurately. And it might be that we can't afford the level of accuracy, or we can't justify the return on a really, really high level of accuracy.
I do want to touch on that use case that you just talked about, because I think that's really incredible, of digging into smaller and smaller segments of our user base. But before I do that, I just want to rewind a little bit, because I think one of the things that anyone client side really struggles with, and it seems to happen more if you have more than one tool, where when you have multiple tools, then it becomes the data is not the source of truth. It's like one tool is maybe more than the other. But I suppose I'm struggling with, does the business get that it doesn't have to be like, or that 90% accurate might be good enough? Like the most common question I get, someone will be looking at something, they'll screenshot some numbers or send me a report and be like, can I trust this data? That is like legitimately the most common thing that gets asked.
You should just have an autoresponder that just says, absolutely, go for it.
Well, but there's the history, right? And that was one of the promises of digital that was an overpromise, was, hey, everybody's moving to digital. Now we can track everything. And that was a fundamental misstep 10 to 15 years ago, that we didn't kind of nip that in the bud and didn't say, time out a little bit on that. And I think the other thing, can I trust this number? When those systems exist, multiple systems exist, a lot of times they're stuck together. Like your digital analytics platform takes through the form completion, and now you're into your CRM or into your fulfillment system. So you have this kind of Venn diagram of overlaps where two systems are measuring something pretty similar. And if somebody says, well, yeah, but which one's right? Then you have to have the discussion of saying they're both right. They're not measuring exactly the same thing. And boy, are people not really, they don't want to hear that as an answer. They want to hear, which one's right. But that question was probably more directed at Yali, and I couldn't stand myself.
I agree with everything you said, Tim. I add to that people want to pick the system. They want to say one of them is right and one of them is wrong. People are really uncomfortable with two systems saying different things and saying that both of them are right in their own way. And related to that, they're really uncomfortable with the idea of precision and this being right to this extent, or this being right or right enough for this set of answers. And there's something wrong about data culture. I think we in digital analytics did let ourselves get carried away by our own hype 10, 15 years ago, but more broadly in data. So before I was in digital data, I was working sort of financial data and working at PwC. And there was very much this idea of data being right and data being wrong. And if you presented a slide and there were some numbers on it, 6 analysts in the room would immediately check that against other numbers that meant the same thing and scream at you if there were any inconsistency. So there's something broader about data and data culture where we're just very binary about I can trust these numbers and I can't trust these numbers. And we actually just need to, I think that desperately needs to change. I don't know how we change it.
I mean, counting the number of votes of who the best picture for the Oscars were, that was a PwC thing, right? Wasn't it? Counting Academy Award votes? Sorry.
I wasn't on that project.
I tend to find with my stakeholders, my advice is often around, if you're looking at something, it's generally week on week, month on month, year on year. If you're comparing this month to last month in the same tool, then that is 100% the best way to look at it. If you're trying to, compare a CRM tool to this other tool, and then you're comparing different time periods, I'm like, that's where you're going to get in a hot mess. So I don't mind which platform you use, just make sure that when you're comparing stuff, you're using the same platform. And that seems to be partially helpful.
But aren't you hitting on that? They'll say, is this number, can I trust this number? And what you're saying is, well, how are you going to use it? And I think that's actually pretty key. Like, it'll get asked, and they're not asking out of malice, like they're trying to hide it from you. They think they're doing this thing. They're not sure about this. So they ask you, is this number, can I trust it? And you're kind of calling out, you have to say, well, give me a little more context, broaden out what you're using it for. If you're comparing your website traffic to your ad serving platforms clicks, well, we need to have that discussion. You can trust the number, but this is likely what you're going to see, and here's why. And I'm sorry, you have to have a little more nuanced understanding about the data. So I think you just hit on something kind of key there.
Yeah. And I think the thing is like everyone is ultimately, from a stakeholder perspective, they're trying to avoid that situation that Yali just mentioned of standing up in front of a bunch of people with a number on a slide and someone else being like, actually, that's not accurate. Yeah. I've seen a different number somewhere else. And that's where that question is coming from. And so I really do, sympathize with the stakeholder in that circumstance. I think the thing is, and I don't know how, someone said this to me the other day about like, is this right? I'm like, I don't think about something as being like right or wrong. Like, we just have to accept that it's the best of what we know, or like the best of what we have. I don't know if there's a better way, to frame that and to get, we found this the other day. So we have an event that's firing, and it's like probably the most important event to us as a business. And it's not getting captured a bunch of times for various reasons, which we're fixing at the moment. And everyone's like, so sorry, for the last 5 years, all our numbers are wrong. I'm like, no, for the last 5 years, they were as good as they could be. Now we've seen that there's a better way to do it, and we're going to implement that. But I still don't know how to get everyone comfortable with data isn't perfect. It's never going to be perfect.
I think part of the solution is at least educating people that data quality is not something that you get for free. And it's not something that you fix and then you have. It's an ongoing investment. And as an organization, if you are investing in fancy analytics tools, if you're investing in data warehouses, if you're investing in like real-time anything, you also need to be investing in data quality. You need to be putting in place things to make sure your tracking is set up right, that your event collection is set up right. All those human things that we like to, when we talk about data quality, talk about things like ITP and stuff going on in the browser that put fundamental limitations on the accuracy. But actually, most of the big issues that I see coming up in companies are related to humans making mistakes, which is what humans do. And that isn't like we've got to move to a world where that is the norm. And actually, we're just putting in place processes and systems so that we catch those mistakes quickly and address them as fast as possible so our data can be as good as possible. And I really like that expression, Mo. The numbers are as good as they can be. And if we carry on investing, we can either keep them at that level or maybe improve the level. But it can't be that binary. The numbers are right or the numbers are wrong.
I think analysts don't even realize, though, that the power that they have in data culture. And like I've talked to my own team about this, where they'll be like, oh, this platform sucks, or this A/B testing tool has a really shit methodology. And I'm like, you can't go around saying that in front of all the stakeholders, because that's what they've got. Like that is what they've got. So unless you're prepared to rip it out and give them something better, like you need to be the person that's helping educate them about how to best use it. Because I mean, for the stakeholder, you can't be like, what you've got sucks, but I'm not going to give you anything else. You know, like that's a really shitty situation to be in. But I don't think analysts realize the stuff that they're saying and the weight that it carries in the business, where people can very quickly completely lose distrust in some sort of platform because of a few flippant comments in an open plan office, you know?
And once that trust is gone, it's gone.
Yeah, it's not coming back.
You're never going to rebuild that. Yeah.
So it's interesting because it's sort of a weird dichotomy, right? Where you have to sort of accept some amount of, I don't know, entropy or something in your data. At the same time, you have to have an alertness and a set of processes and governance in place to ensure appropriate and correct data collection, right? And so like this concept of an always on process for data, Yali, that you mentioned, I think I completely agree with. You know, we were very disserved as analysts and as an industry by the concept of a IT project type implementation where you go do it and then you put it on the shelf and you never come back and look at it again. And it's much different than that. It is an always on process now. It has to be. I've made a great living going back and forth to companies where they do the project, they walk away, and then 4 years later, they're like, okay, well, let's do it all again. And it's sort of like, what have you been doing in the meantime? Well, mostly just not trusting any of it. It's like, oh, cool. Yeah, there's got to be a better way. I don't know if that's not really a question, but I think, you know, that point is one that I just wish more people could grab onto. And Mo, your point about analysts kind of needing to take ownership of that and not kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. A lot of folks don't realize the damage they do to their own credibility by saying that stuff out loud. And that's a problem too, because it's not good sometimes.
I feel like there's a flip side. I mean, I think analysts are equally likely to even subconsciously not want to acknowledge the limitations of the data they have for that very reason. They want to trust and believe that the data is fine. Even if they read, I mean, an ITP is a good example because on the one hand, you've got people who are analysts who kind of don't really want to understand what's going on because it's messy and complicated and it's not easy to solve. And they don't want to stand up and say, oh, by the way, we have this other thing that the world is different now than it was a year ago. And to maintain a similar level of accuracy, we're going to need to invest. And that's kind of unpleasant. But at the same time, there is also the tendency to say the sky is falling without even going and looking at the volume of Safari traffic to your site. So I do feel like there is a lack of nuanced thinking. And it seems like even on the accuracy, there's the monitoring and the testing side, But there's also kind of the logging side. I've never seen anyone say, let's just write down what we know or limitations. Every time that I go to a site and I'm trying to look at what firing for Google Analytics and nothing's firing, and then I realize that I'm running Ghostery and the default setting is to block Google Analytics, and I'm like, son of a bitch. Okay, so let me turn that off and fire it again. Like, we should have a list. We don't necessarily need to go out and blast it out to our stakeholders of these are all the things that are fucking with our data. But have we as analysts even sat down and said, for our site, these are the things. These are what it would take to mitigate. This is kind of roughly the scale of them. Stuff we can control, stuff we can't control. Stuff we can control could have testing. Stuff we can't control is, ad blockers potentially.
Yeah. And here's our estimate of the impact of that, right? Or something around
just
that.
Internally within the analytics team.
Yep.
I think you can get pretty precise about the impact of some of these things. So a really nice approach, and I'm always surprised that more companies don't adopt this, is just to instrument server-side tracking alongside client-side tracking. So client-side tracking, it's a wild west. Like, you've got no control over the browser. There could be any number of plugins that are running. They could be playing all kinds of havoc with the data. The person in the browser might not even be a person. It might be a bot. So it's a total free-for-all. But server-side tracking, that really is accurate. If you're tracking things like transactions or anything on the website or the mobile app that hits the server, you can track that with close to 100% accuracy.
But you struggle to filter, the bots. Like, that's going to be, but that'll be an upper bound, right?
It doesn't solve the bots thing. That's true.
Bots create an artifact on servers as well. Yep.
But you can then compare the numbers from the two, and you can see, we've got this percentage of users that we see server side, and we see nothing from them client side. So all those people, that's kind of a minimum bound on the number of people that are on our site that are blocking our tracking. So we're in a pretty good place, because then we've got a sample set, to your statistics point earlier, and we know what percentage of our population roughly. It might be a slightly smaller percentage if there are a load of users on the website that are just doing things that wouldn't hit a server. But we've got then a pretty good idea of what our sample size is relative to the population size. And that's a great starting point for most analyses that we need to perform.
Well, and I also think, since you brought up the word transactions, I think that's a great one to work around a little, because it is a very good example of where you need higher or lower levels of context in terms of what you're trying to do. Because if you're just trying to see, like, well, what are my biggest closing marketing channels or those kinds of things in aggregate, the reporting is just fine. But as you step into the minutia or try to work out your promotion strategy for particular segments of customers, you have to go outside of the digital data collection anyway, because you have to understand things about the customer and their activities. Like, I don't want to give massive promotions to someone who's also returning products at a crazy rate. So how do I get that? So you've got to go in and integrate those things. And digital analytics tools are not great at doing that in their reporting interface, which is why almost every, what I'll say, sophisticated implementation does today is extrapolate that into some other data store to integrate with other systems and then resurface into other things. And you actually see Google, Adobe, others all responding to that by building data analysis tools that actually incorporate other data sets and sources now. And so it used to be you'd had to get your data out. So Google BigQuery or the data feed or, Snowplow is kind of nice because you're not beholden to any of those platforms. So you can kind of start with just the data and then move wherever. But that integration necessity only becomes more and more obvious, but you don't have to run all of your reporting that way. It's just, you have to understand the levels of granularity that you have to get to. And I think people don't really understand how to kind of think through that model and then make the right choices, because there's a lot of cost to getting your data clean enough to go into that level of granularity of what are my customer set that returns products too much versus sort of, how's my overall marketing channel performance look?
And I think at that moment where you get your data either out of your analytics platform, your digital data, so you can integrate it with other data sets, or you bring the other data sets in. I'm much more familiar with the former than the latter approach. That's where a lot of these consistency issues raise their heads, because suddenly you've got the data sat alongside each other and you're actually joining it to perform your analysis. That's also where we have the opportunity to start triangulating and start sizing up these quality issues. So if you've got your transactions recorded client side and server side, and you've got some financial system that's a real source of truth, now you can make that measurement, and hopefully your financial system agrees with your server side tracking, and there's some discrepancy with your client side tracking. You can measure that discrepancy quite precisely, and you've got some notion of accuracy. And I've even seen sort of examples where companies have got, Snowplow set up alongside a Google or an Adobe, and they're reconciling those numbers against each other, which is a very time intensive and not very pleasant process.
Yeah.
But you can literally do it cookie by cookie. Like, what are the cookie IDs that we see in
very time intensive?
Well, and I think the one time that I really went deep on that with a couple of really sharp guys, and it was over a decade ago, and it was server logs with WebTrends page tag logs, and it was super, super informative. Like, I recommend everybody go through one of those exercises somewhere in their life if you're an analyst, because just once. And then you'll say, I'll never do that again. But you start to say, okay, This is a big class that's a difference. Understand it, put it aside. And then ultimately you wind up with, and we have no idea what's going on with these, but you know what? We found all these other ones that we now understand. This is complicated and nuanced. But if you go through that sort of exercise, if that data is coming in, as you guys are talking about bringing the data in, that tends to be back at that user or transaction level. Does that start to give you a scale for where the misses are? Kind of, Yali, when you were talking earlier, like putting aside the reporting and the counting and the aggregated, and think about the personalization, the data science, the machine learning, which of these users are we going to have incomplete or inaccurate data that we're likely to not make the next best offer? It seems like you could use that reconciliation to say, you know what, for 10% of our users, we can't get, all 15 data fields. We're only going to get 4, which means we're higher up in the classification tree. We're still going to do our best shot, because it seems like it's more likely to be incomplete data than inaccurate data. And you're like, what's the scale of the ones that we're not able to do our ideal personalization? So those seem like they could be related.
I think so. I think there are a couple of really interesting points to bring out there. So on the personalization point, I think one of the things that companies would be better off if they do want to go down the personalization route is spending more time investing in data collection and less time investing in sophisticated algorithms. So people love to buy and experiment with expensive algorithms, but you're likely to have a bigger impact on your recommendation engine by doing boring things like making sure you're pulling together all your data about this user and running that through the algorithm, then tweaking the algorithm, and then making sure that the place where you serve the recommendation is one which makes sense from the user experience, and just A/B testing that, than actually spending loads of time faffing about with different algorithms. And I think the same is true on the attribution side. If you've got money to invest, you'll see a bigger return on it investing in getting your data collection in order and putting in place that ongoing investment in the data collection than you would in investing in sexy tech that does sexy stuff with the data that actually the accuracy of the data doesn't really support, bluntly.
All right, the show's going great so far, but we need to talk about one of our sponsors here in the multi-touch moment. Hey, Josh, you know how there's certain business questions that seem to crop up over and over again, and on it goes? It's just a well-beaten path, if you know what I'm saying. And that question is, what are the top paths on our website? You know how your colleagues are always asking that?
Yeah, I usually just fake an illness when I get that one.
Yeah, well, good news. It's now easier than ever to find the answer to this timeless time suck of a question with the new Top Paths add-on for GA. So it's going to parse through your user data and surface the top paths browsing your website. I mean, don't worry about Markov chains anymore. Mark of Buttsville, New Jersey is our top osteopath on the site this week. Or forget about path tracing. Tracy of Greasy Corner, Arizona was the top natural path on the site yesterday.
Man, forget the CCPA. Stephanie Gray is the top sociopath on our site this week.
Sociopath, exactly. I mean, it's just time to just sort of know if you need to find an allopath or a telepath or a homeopath.
Even a pathological liar.
Exactly. It's never been easier to befuddle your stakeholders with useless path information. So take the happy path and install our new add-on today.
Okay, I just want to pull this back a minute and make it really practical for, say, an analyst sitting in a company doing exactly this right now. So step one, you have your analytics tool. You start doing comparisons to your backend events or like your own data warehouse or your own, whatever your internal source of truth is, so that you can understand the discrepancies. Then you go through and one by one, you start fixing all of those things. That's great. You start building confidence in whatever the platform is. The bit that I struggle with is the incomplete data, because it's really easy to compare different numbers and be like, okay, why are these things happening? It's much more difficult to find out what you don't have. So do you want to talk me a little bit through, just, hypothetically, how you might tackle that?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. I think the best you can hope for is identify a set of known unknowns. So a set of cases where you're missing data, but you're always going to have to accept that there are other unknowns that you might not know about. So starting with your investment in data quality. So you've got some number or some report that you have, and you want to build confidence. You want to build assurance that that number that you're presenting is right and that you're not missing anything in that number that you're reporting. And so that number is a metric. And that's computed in some way, and it's computed on some underlying data, event data that's collected in some system or another. And so building confidence that the final number that you're reporting is accurate and is complete, I think means going down into each different step in generating that number and thinking, how much confidence do I have in that part of the process? And the part of the process that's the hardest one to reason about, the one that's sort of most open to there being incomplete data, is the data collection bit. So the bit that's right at the beginning, where you're collecting the underlying events that the metric is computed on. Because especially if those events are collected from a website, from JavaScript that's happening in the browser, it's a fundamentally an unreliable place to do that data collection. So comparing that data with data that you've got server side is a really good start. But if you think about a user's journey on the web, there's certain things that a user will do that might never hit a server. So loading a page might serve that. You might have that page served from a CDN, or adding things to basket, or doing stuff on the page. That might all be JavaScript. That it might not touch a server. So that's really the bit of the process that you've got to be most nervous about. There's the highest level of uncertainty. And so I think with that stuff, the best thing you can do is make sure that your tracking is set up right. So to build confidence that where you've got tracking in place and where that tracking is firing, the data that's coming off that tracking is accurate. And the best approach, the most promising approach that I've seen to that being done right is automated testing. So engineers have this idea that whenever you release a new version of an application, there are key user workflows that you want to make sure aren't accidentally broken, because you want to be constantly improving your application all the time. And so there are test suites that will simulate, if you're an online retailer, a shopper landing on the website and going through and adding items to basket and then purchasing. And each time at a modern e-com company, each time a new version of the website is published, hundreds of those tests will be run on every different combination of browsers and different devices and so on, to make sure that the experience isn't accidentally broken for one of those users, one of those browsers and one of those devices. So I think that analysts taking that approach and saying, well, can we write automated tests? So when a simulated user is going through these journeys, we're also checking that the data that's collected for those simulated users is accurate and exactly describes the journey that user's gone through. That's really powerful. And I think that would catch a huge number of tracking errors, because most of the issues we see with companies with data collection predate ITP and predate all that stuff. It's development teams and implementation engineers, and sometimes the analyst in GTM or whatever that has made some mistake with the tracking setup or done something unrelated to tracking that's inadvertently broken the tracking, and that's only been discovered much later.
But that is the value proposition of an observe point or a data true or a QA2L, I think, right? Like we're talking.
I'm not so familiar with those solutions, so I can't really talk to them. My understanding was they do some sort of tag auditing. So they crawl your website and they check the tags firing on each site, which is a different thing to running tests where you're simulating users doing different things and you're checking the data that is emitted when the users do those things against those tests in a formal way. It might be they do that.
And they do both, but it's like to me, like if you're running, let's take Adobe Analytics, because that's where you may have 30 different variables and you can define kind of the common user path. And those tools have the ability to say, define that path. But even while it can check a ton of different browsers and operating systems, that's still kind of one simulated user. A lot of times it does have to go through, you really care the most about the post authentication or the post credit card or the post, transaction. So now you're saying, well, we got to do something all the way through a transaction. We don't want to inadvertently record a false transaction. And oh, by the way, if we're changing the user experience, which is another risk of where the tracking will be broken, we have to go update those scripts before we can really run them. Or if we don't, they may break. And I know they're kind of more just, I'm blanking on the names of some of those simulation platforms, but I know I've talked about them with QA people. Like it seems like that is a really big lift, and it's still going to cover a fairly narrow view. With, say, Adobe Analytics, you may say, yeah, the tag's still firing and I'm still capturing the page name and these three variables, but you know what? EVAR 22, that's what got broken because of the logic here, and here didn't populate. So I'm then kind of stuck either saying, let me script exactly one scenario and populate all of those values, or I only check for kind of the key ones. Like I've never personally had that actually be put in at scale in a way that works, even though I'd love to have it.
I feel like when you start processing this problem at scale, like those tools and models struggle because there's so many different ways that somebody could access sort of a web application or a website. And so it's really hard. Whereas at your company, Tim, that you've built these validation engines that actually can run in real time on the data collection to validate type and those kinds of things. And I think Yali's Snowplow does something similar. So, there's these ways to actually look at the data as it's flowing through and saying like, was that a number? That wasn't a number. That was a string. Okay, something's wrong here.
But that's more checking as the data is coming in as opposed to actually going out and triggering the data? Are those?
Yeah,
no?
Because your website offers lots of people to go test that data for you in real time. And so it's not like they're stopping visiting your website. So you can go crawl the site and do those user journeys and do the automation testing. And I think that's good. But I think there's another side of that, which is actually watch as the data flows in and say, what am I catching? It's sort of like those cool machines you see that like knock the green tomatoes out of the process so that only the red tomatoes go through. And it's amazing because it's sort of like there's just these little paddles and you're just like, how did they tell that was a green tomato? But anyways, we'll tweet a GIF if we can.
Yeah. And I'm definitely a fan of the monitoring the data to see if it stays normal. And I guess, but Yali, where the tools you're thinking of, where do those fit? How's that work?
So I think I think you need to do both. So I think automated testing is part of the solution. And the idea with that is you're trying to catch errors before they ever get pushed in production. But they're only going to catch a certain percentage of the issues. As you both quite rightly said, you're never going to write tests for every single scenario. So there'll always be some things that can slip in. And then validating the data as it's processed is a second approach. And the more prescriptive you can be about the structure and the shape of the data, the stricter you can be with the validation. And if you're monitoring it in real time and if you're flagging data quality issues in real time, you can hopefully fix them as they come up or pretty soon after they come up, which is a much better situation than being an analyst going to the business saying, hey, look, I found this really interesting thing in the numbers. Did you know this metric's up or this metric's down, only to deep dive on that and have to report back to the business 3 weeks later that it's because some new version of the mobile app went out where something was broken. And as that rolled out, the metric went up or down. And then as that was fixed, the metric returned to where it was before. I think there's a third. So if we think about that monitoring on the stream, there are two things to think about. One is validating each event, each field, each type. Is the value in a sensible range? Like, is the price a positive number? Is it a negative number? That sort of thing. But then there's also looking at the overall flow of traffic and just saying, like, are there any anomalies here, looking at the data at a more aggregate level? Because that might suggest that there's either a data collection issue or that something really, really interesting is happening and we should investigate that straight away.
So what about definitional differences? So I sometimes think like companies actually make it hard for themselves because for whatever reason they choose to define metrics differently. So whether it's definition of a session or an active user or whatever the case may be.
They choose to define it differently from who?
From whatever the tool is that they're using.
Okay.
So I don't know, like one example, choosing that a session is 24 hours of inactivity instead of 30 minutes to 4 hours, for example. You as the analyst are then always going to be in this position of things never matching. And you know why. I don't know. Do you just accept that? Do you just continue to explain like, and this is why they don't match up and that's okay as long as you're doing comparisons within this tool and not, I don't.
I think there are two bits with the definition. So there's the definition of how the data is collected. So if we're going to track a transaction, what's the point that we track the transaction? Is it when the button's clicked? Is it when the thank you page is shown? Is it when the transaction's cleared? And then there's the harder thing, which is even with the inconsistency in potentially how we're collecting this data from different places, how are we then computing the metrics of sessions or revenue or unique visitors or whatever that thing is? I think definitions are so important. You can't even begin to talk about accuracy unless you've got a clear set of, and unless you've finished having the discussion about which definition is the one that you as a company are going to commit to. And my personal feeling, this is pretty niche, but is that the classics like uniques and sessions are so problematic that I think companies would be best off jettisoning them altogether and just being really clear what decisions they're making and coming up with their own set of metrics that are really well understood for measuring them. So one of the odd things about coming to digital analytics, having worked with data from other disciplines, was that sort of the analysts take the metrics that the tool presents, whereas in like other data disciplines, you're just working in Excel and it's up to you which Excel formula you stick in. And that's your metric is whatever the Excel function is that you've stuck in that cell. And we, in digital analytics community, we've totally confused everything by coming up with one set of words that different vendors apply in different ways, and then not putting the time and attention into tracking. So actually, they're not even computing on the same set of underlying events in different cases. Sorry, that was a total ramble. I can't remember if I answered your question, I think.
No, I think that was a useful ramble. And it also, I suppose, gives me confidence that maybe the best solution is, from a business perspective, defining like, this is the metric that matters to us and this is how we're going to calculate it. And then doing like a shit hot job of actually educating the business. And that's something we spend a lot of time talking about at the moment. This is how we define this metric. Like where I work now, an active user is not someone that had a session. It's someone that actually opened a design, clicked on something. Like you have to have actively used the product to be counted. And I actually think that that's like personally really cool that you're not just being like, oh, you landed on our site and therefore we're counting you as a user. But I guess my advice to the business is we need to keep reminding people of what that definition is, because otherwise it can get really, really murky where people are counting users and active users and then they're not talking the same language because people start new, and when you're growing, people don't understand what the definition is. So it's like this constant thing that you have to hammer home about how you're calculating it.
And Mo, if you're doing context dependent definitions like that, how do you ever compare yourself to your competitors? So that's no. Okay.
I've got one super relevant to exactly this is that Simo kind of made hay on this for a while. Like 4.5 years ago, he wrote the Schema Conspiracy, where he kind of goes through and basically just rips all the reasons that like you think you know a session is a session and a user is a user, and look at all of these assumptions that are made. And then I think kind of really the answer to all of this is not anytime somebody asks you about accuracy, just report everything with 4 decimal places and say you focus on precision, not on accuracy, and then just kind of walk out of the room really quickly. Okay, one of those might have been helpful.
Speaking of walking out of the room really quickly, we've got to start to wrap up. The good news here is we've done it. Congratulations, the 4 of us, we've solved it. So anyone listening to the show, you now know what to do with your data. No, there's so much more to this. It is a unique experience, but there are hopefully some common elements that emerged. Yali, thank you so much for kind of helping guide the discussion. One thing we love to do on the show is go around the horn and do a last call. Something we found that's interesting, we've found fascinating, or something we're excited about. Yali, you're our guest. Would you like to share your last call?
Sure. So I think this has been out for quite a while, but I've only discovered this recently and it kind of blew my mind. There's a series of posts on quantum.country called Quantum Computing for the Very Curious. And it's like a complete beginner's guide to quantum computing. So they're a really lovely set of posts. It's a really interesting subject that I didn't know anything about. And it's a kind of a very... They make it as easy as they can. It's easy enough that while I'm reading it, I feel like I understand it. And then when I go away, I realize that I didn't understand anything. But actually, they try and solve that problem. So you don't just go to the site and read the stuff. You sign up and then they ping you like at certain intervals, like 2 hours later or 4 hours later, 16 hours later, to just ask you a couple of questions. And the idea is that you answer those emails, you do the questionnaires, and they help your memory process what you read so that a few days later you really can recount it. So they call that a mnemonic medium. It totally didn't work on me. I couldn't tell you how quantum computing worked, but I enjoyed trying.
They ask you a yes/no question and the answer is amplitude, or that it's both simultaneously or something. Is that
something like that? Yeah. Quantum.country. You gotta check it out.
Wow. That looks awesome.
That's very cool.
Yeah, it's all right. All right, Mo, what about you?
I've got a twofer because they're both kind of little. But I only just found out about Makeover Monday. Have you guys heard of it?
No.
So it's makeovermonday.co.uk. And if you're really into data viz, basically like people go there for fun and makeover visualizations. So yeah, we had someone at Data and Analytics Wednesday present on it the other day, and I thought it would be fun if you're into data viz. But guess who has appeared again? It is one Matt Walker. So I read an article yesterday called I watched over 100 TED Talks and these insights have stuck with me the most by Aria Benix. And she refers to Matthew Walker, author of Why We Sleep, who has now done a TED Talk on the topic. So if you're not taking my sage advice of reading Why We Sleep, you can just watch a really short TED Talk where he shares a bunch of learnings. And also her article's really great because it just wraps up a whole bunch of really interesting threads from TED.
Excellent.
Tim is trying to contain himself right now.
No. I'm still partly. I haven't finished that book either. It's still partially read.
You just keep falling asleep when you try to read it. Is that?
Well, I keep trying to finish it, and then I realize I should go read the book finish, and then I can't finish that, and it's kind of this whole chain of things where just nothing happens.
Easy now. All right, Tim. Well, something should happen. What's your last call?
So I think I have one of my life goals is to have sufficient intuition around the birthday paradox to actually be able to put somebody to sleep at a cocktail party and explaining it to them. But as she is prone to do, good old Cassie Kozrakov has done it again. So early in October, she wrote a post called Using the Birthday Paradox to Teach Probability Fundamentals. So it doesn't just go into the math of the birthday paradox, which still kind of like where Yali is with quantum mechanics, I am with basic probability theory. So that's how that can be measured. I understand the birthday paradox for in the moment when I'm reading it, and then I can't articulate it later. But this post, it's a lengthy post, but she goes into kind of different approaches to thinking about probability. And it's always delightful because she's got her little linguistic tangents that are always amusing. So I recommend it for anybody who's exploring probability and the birthday paradox in particular.
Very cool. All right.
What do you got?
Well, at the top of the show, Mo mentioned how she is not a fan of mechanical keyboards, but my last call is actually related to that, in that there's an article I read where it demonstrates why mechanical keyboards are in fact superior to other types of keyboards. And
rather than speaking, could you just like type out in the chat and we'll just kind of like listen to the ticka 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 as you
Absolutely. Just listen. But actually one of the reasons why they're superior, which goes back to the topic of the show, is it makes you a more accurate typer. And so if we think about all these implementation issues, they're probably happening because people aren't using mechanical keyboards enough.
That's fantastic.
But I think we should actually test the accuracy of my typing without a mechanical keyboard versus your typing with, and see whether that's true.
Well, so first off, Mo, you have to remember, I have people who type things for me most of the time. So it's really not an accurate test. So anyway,
I think the design of that experiment has some flaws that would also give inaccurate results, but that was a masterful bringing it all together there.
Hey, listen. And speaking of bringing it all together, you've probably been listening and you're like, oh my gosh, you're talking about the set of problems I'm facing right now, or these are the challenges I'm running, or you didn't even talk about this aspect that's causing pain in my life, in my data being accurate or not complete. So we'd love to hear from you, preferably if you liked what we said, not if we missed a bunch of really important topics. But either one will work. The best way to do that is through the Measure Slack, or you can also reach out to us on Twitter or on our LinkedIn group. And we'd love to hear from you. And that's all I have to say about that. Yali, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been really good fun.
It's been great. And I know I speak for my two co-hosts, Mo and Tim, when I say, regardless of your data accuracy, just keep analyzing.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to join the conversation on Facebook, Twitter, or Measure Slack group. We welcome your comments and questions. Visit us on the web at analyticshour.io, facebook.com/analyticshour, or at analyticshour on Twitter.
So smart guys wanted to fit in, so they made up a term called analytics. Analytics don't work.
Analytics. Oh my God. What the fuck does that even mean?
I hate people that have mechanical keyboards. They deserve to die a strong, violent death.
Well, Mo, so you're wrong, and I still love you anyway, but you're absolutely 100% wrong.
Mechanical keyboards are like literally the biggest disruption to being in workflow. It's like you're listening to some music, bopping away, and suddenly there's...
And to that, I would say that it's very obvious you've never seriously played a video game in your life.
Obviously, except Mortal Kombat, which you had the hand control-y thingies.
See, Yali, what happened was that you actually resolved all your mechanical or all your audio difficulties about 7 minutes sooner than we normally do with guests. So now it's just filler of dishing shit until we apparently start recording.
It's like you're a technologist or something, like you really understand computers and systems. You should really think about, being a chief product officer of some kind of company.
You've done this before, Michael Helpling.
Oh, Mo, you've seen me do it before. Like, it's literally the same conversation. It's like, let's describe this. I'm like, no, I'm just going to ask you to describe it. And that way I don't have to remember that.
My type token ratio analysis of presidential candidate tweets actually made it in the Our Weekly blogs thing today. I could totally log roll my last call. That would put people to sleep.
Look at you. Maybe I should last call that, Tim, so you don't appear to be desperate.
Plus, he's desperate for a last call, so it works out nicely.
Exactly. It's like...
I don't don't know if that's at all a coherent thread, if anybody was riding along with that particular.
Struggling.
Rock flag and accuracy.